Today I have a different type of video. I'm not going to be talking about a deck, and it's not going to have any gameplay. So let me know what you think of this format and if this is the type of thing anyone's interested in or if it's just a little bit too boring for everybody. So basically I want to talk about how to evaluate cards in Duelyst, how to tell if they're good or bad, and what that means in the context of our decks. So the first thing we want to talk about when we evaluate cards is what are their costs. Now, every card is going to have a mana cost. It's going to cost a card because we have to play that card from our hand, and thus we no longer have that resource. And they have a deck building cost. So the mana cost is the most apparent to pretty much all players. And the reason mana cost is important is it affects both when we can play the card and what other cards we can pair it with on that turn. Mana is a resource that we have, so if we spend more of it, we have less of it to do other things. And it also has the kind of the hard barrier of when we can play a card. For instance, a card that cost 10 mana would almost never see play because we could never play it. Unless we had a mana tile available after our 9th mana crystal was activated. So it's not so mana cost is kind of the strictest barrier for a card to be played. If you have a game that's ending before you get to 7 mana cards are as good as blank. So mana cost is important, and figuring out a mana curve such that you have plays on every turn is one of the key aspects of deck building. The second less intuitive cost for, I think, newer players, but that people pick up rather quickly, is that each card costs the card that you have to play. It costs the resource in your hand, it costs the ability to replace that card. That's why sometimes late game, if you're down to one card and you draw something like a Healing Mystic, you don't want to play that card, even though you have infinity mana on that turn. You have 9 mana and you're only playing a 2 mana card, so the mana cost is effectively nil. But you don't want to play that because you lose the value of that card. You no longer have a resource of just the generic card in your hand. So something like a Sunstone Bracer doesn't see play in many cases, even though it costs 0 mana, because the impact of the card is so low that if you're playing low impact cards, unless you can play significantly more of them, and that's where aggro decks get their power, is they are able to play more cards than their opponent by having lower mana threats and by utilizing more of the cards in their hand even if they're not drawing more cards. So the problem with a card like Sunstone Bracer is that the impact is so low that losing out on that resource of a card puts you too far behind in terms of attrition, even if you can get ahead in tempo or in damage. And the third cost, and the most difficult to pinpoint and probably the least acknowledged by new players, is deck building cost. And that's the question of what do I need to do with my deck to make this card good. And some cards require almost no deck building cost. A card like Spectral Revenant requires you don't have to do anything to make Spectral Revenant a good card. It will just come down and it will attack with Rush and it will do damage and it will be good in almost any deck. There are some decks that might not want to play it if they're faster, but that's more of a mana consideration than building your deck around a specific card. And these are the cards that you'll see that are staples in most archetypes have very low deck building costs because they require nothing to be good, so they can be slotted into multiple different decks. Now, on the contrary, we have a card like Un7, which, if you saw my video the other day, works with Dying Wish minions, and it has Dying Wish, summon a minion with Dying Wish from your action bar. It's 4 mana, it's a 2/4. So this requires the deck building cost of both having Dying Wish minions in your deck and not having low value Dying Wish minions because you want this Dying Wish to get value. So if you had, for instance, we played the card Ray, and the liability there was if this dies, you could get Ray from this ability rather than getting the high value minions which we played, which were Duelyst, Amarahelia, and Osterix. So in order to make the card Un7 good, we had to put the cards Osterix, Duelyst, Amarahelia in our deck. And some of those are very good cards. Duelyst and Amarahelia is very good. But we had to go the extra mile of putting Osterix in our card, which is a card that we normally wouldn't play. And Osterix requires us to play artifacts. which we may not have wanted to play in the volume we did. So all these cards required us to change the way we would build our deck. And if we're making less optimal choices in a vacuum for our deck, then that's the deck building cost. So next up we have, when is the card good? And this sounds like a silly question, but when we're playing cards, we want to ask, what are the situations where this card is going to get its maximum potential, and which situations isn't? So a card like Spectral Revenant is almost always good. It's good on an empty board, it's good when you're behind, it's good when you're ahead, it's good when you're at parity. That's a card that's always good. And how good is it? Well, that's very effective because it does damage, it helps clear the board. It's almost always a good card. When is it bad? Okay, if we take a card like Mirage Master, which we can zoom in on a bit, I think. When is this bad? This is bad on an empty board, when your opponent has no minions, because then it's a 1/1 for 4, which is not good. And if we ask a card how bad is something, well, in this case, the card is a 4-mana 1/1. The lower bound for how bad a card can be is basically a blank. Basically replace fodder. A card can't really be worse than a blank. It can't force you to play it. So the most a card can be is blank, which means it just costs you a card even if you don't play it. So that's how bad a card can be. And how often is the card bad? And what we want to do there is look at all the scenarios where a card won't be effective compared to scenarios where it will be. And this can help us compare different cards that, are similar. For instance, if we have a card like, and the other question is, what is required to make it good? And does it matter that it's good? And I think these questions actually kind of best answered or discussed in the context of maybe these two cards, Ancestral Divination and Heaven's Eclipse, which are both Songhai cards and are both very similar. They both draw cards, they both have mid costs. So what makes Heaven's Eclipse see ought to play and Ancestral Divination doesn't? Well, how often is the card good? Well, Heaven's Eclipse is good when you've run out of resources and when you have the ability to take a turn off in terms of mana, where you're spending 5 mana. You may be able to play other spells, but you're often going to eat a major part of your mana for the turn, and it draws you cards. So when is it good? When you need more cards and you have mana. So that's when Heaven's Eclipse is good. Now, what's the scenario when Ancestral Divination is good? Well, in the same types of turns, when you have mana but you need more cards, but also when you have minions on the battlefield. So if it's late in the game and you top deck it, Heaven's Eclipse is a very good card, because you can draw 3 cards. The best card you can draw late in the game is often a card that says, draw more cards. Because, the best card in your deck isn't going to be good as the 2 best cards in your deck, or the 3 best cards in your deck. So rather than drawing a 4 Winds Magi, we'd rather draw Heaven's Eclipse into a 4 Winds Magi and a Phoenix Fire and a Spiral Technique, or anything like that. But Ancestral Divination in that situation is very bad. Now, when is it better? Well, if you have 3 spells, anytime you have less than 5 mana, Ancestral Divination is better, or at least as good, because you can play it and you can't play Heaven's Eclipse. And being able to, a card that you can't play is a blank. So even if you had no friendly minions on the battlefield, but you had a Blood Rage Mask, Ancestral Divination is better than Heaven's Eclipse if you have less than 5 mana. So what's required for it to be good? Well, it requires minions on the battlefield. And it requires, usually, for it to be good, at least, I think we would say 2. Drawing 2 cards for 4 mana is probably not a good rate, but is playable. Drawing 1 card for 4 mana is very bad, because we would rather just have that card not be in our deck and have drawn a different card. Or we'd rather just replace it. And it's just, replacing itself for 1 mana, or for 4 mana, just sets us too far back on tempo and gains us no card advantage. So, and now when is this better? If we have more than 3 minions on the board, we would draw more cards than Heaven's Eclipse. And the question is, when does that matter? Or does that matter? Is there a scenario where drawing 4 cards is significantly better than drawing 3? And I think most of the time the answer would be no, because when we already have the resource late in the game, when we have traded out resources and we're going to be playing these draw spells, drawing 3 cards is often going to be more than enough to play over the next couple turns, that the additional cards don't really value, any additional card isn't really valued at 1 card, because it's not an additional resource so much as card selection. The game's not going to go much longer than after the turn you play the Heaven's Eclipse. So does it matter the scenarios when Ancestral Divination is bad? If I had 3 minions on the battlefield, or 4 minions on the battlefield, do I care that I drew a Heaven's Eclipse instead of Ancestral Divination? And I think usually the answer is no. So that's why Heaven's Eclipse is almost always a better card, because it's good more often, it's bad less often. In the scenarios when it's worse, don't actually matter. The difference, because the only difference between any cards are whether or not one card would lose you the game, or one card would win you the game, and one card would not. So the question is that if we have a scenario where we could just choose whether we had Ancestral Divination or Heaven's Eclipse, they are effectively the same card unless one of them would lose us the game and one of them would win us the game, or one of them would win us the game. So I think that in the situations where Ancestral Divination looks substantially better, it's actually effectively just the same card. So that's why you see a card like Heaven's Eclipse see a lot more play. Next we want to look at, does it pose a threat or answer one? There are about 3 types of cards, but there's cards that, pose a threat to your opponent. Will my opponent have to answer it, or will it win the game, or provide an advantage? I forgot a parentheses. So, does this advance my game plan of winning the game? Because some cards will not do that. Some cards are meant to stop our opponents from winning the game themselves, and those are the answers. But our threats are the ones that allow us to win the game. So if our opponent was AFK for whatever reason, which cards would allow us to play and then win the game by, taking actions just on our own, as opposed to responding to the actions of our opponent. So threats are the proactive plays that we have, whereas answers are the reactive plays. And both are useful, but it's important to understand the distinction, because it's often said that there are no wrong threats, but there are wrong answers, because answers are almost always situational, whereas threats that are threatening to win the game are almost always going to win the game. The effective threats are almost always going to win the game or provide a game-winning advantage if they're left unanswered. So, that's kind of the difference between you can have too many answers if your opponent doesn't have threats, but you really can't have too many threats. So, those are kind of the 2 types of cards. And then you'll have support cards, which are neither, and those require some synergies to be worthwhile. You don't generally just want to play a card that neither answers a threat nor poses one, because those those only work in conjunction with other threats or with answers. So the exception is kind of card draw, because those are just trading mana for time, so those will draw you into threats and answers, and that's kind of like a gray area of that. So we look at some threats, and we have things like Inquisitor Kron, which, if left on the battlefield, will pump out 2/2s, and will just threaten to win the game. It will keep providing value, and it will overwhelm your opponent if they can't answer. And what made this card so strong, it actually got nerfed, it's now a 4/4. But what made it so strong was it required an answer almost immediately, because even just the ability to pump out 2 prisoners was often a game-winning advantage. So when we say a threat threatens to end the game or win the game, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to kill our opponent by itself, because in Duelyst, almost no individual cards can kill the opponent by themselves from 25 life. It just, because generals have an attack value. So next is Heartseeker. And Heartseeker is just we're mostly talking about the Bloodborne spell of Riva, and this is why Riva is so effective, is because Riva's Bloodborne spell is the ability to produce constant threats, which allows her to deck build around not having as many threats, and play more support cards that make her threats more powerful, such as Killing Edge. because that will basically turn any of these Heart Seekers into a very large threat. And threats have varying degrees of threateningness, because some threats don't require an immediate answer, like a Heart Seeker. Heart Seeker will provide a ping, which is a continuous advantage, but if you leave a Heart Seeker on the board by itself and it's not buffed, it doesn't really threaten to turn into a game-winning advantage. But if you were to leave a Heart Seeker with a killing edge on the board for a couple turns, it will probably take out 2 of your minions or deal 10 damage to your face, and at that point the advantage might become too substantial to overcome. And then, we have another Sonkai card, which is Lantern Fox. And Lantern Fox is not going to win the game by itself, and it's not going to provide unlimited value. But if this card is able to provide 2 Phoenix Fires, it's often a significant enough advantage that the other player can't come back just from this game of attrition. If the Lantern Fox is able to trade for a card itself and provide 2 more cards, or even just 1 more card, the card advantage is difficult to come back from. And that's what makes another reason Songhai is very powerful, is it can produce early game threats that require efficient answers, or they'll just gain incremental advantages. So these are, some of the good threats in the game right now. And, what's required to deal with these is types of answer cards. And, we have basically 2 types of answers, and I actually wish I included more variety, but, Egg-Morph and Bear Seal are what we call hard removal. Hard removal will remove anything. It doesn't trigger... The main characteristic of hard removal is it removes everything. And that's what these 2 do, barring minions that can't be targeted or whatever, such as Mechazor, which, is kind of an exception. We'll just ignore that for now. So what hard removal does is just removes everything, and in these cases, it doesn't trigger Dying Wishes, which is an important characteristic of these, because so many minions either get value from opening gambits or Dying Wishes. So that's, a pile of stats minion is generally not something that sees a ton of play. So these are our answers to, those type of minions. And what makes an answer good or bad is how effective it is in terms of cards and how effective it is in terms of mana. So if we were to have a Kron that's able to produce prisoners and we're only able to answer with a Bear Seal, then that answer might be ineffective in that case, because it's already produced value and we're trading 1 card for 1 card, but they were able to get value out of the card. And that's not a knock on Bear Seal so much as it is a demonstration of how powerful some threats can be if they're able to trade with removal but also provide an advantage. And Egg-Morph can be weak against minions that are low cost but are also, need to be removed. Something like Lantern Fox. Egg-Morphing a Lantern Fox is a pretty big tempo disadvantage, especially because you need to use your attack, an attack from a minion or your general that turn to kill off the egg. So, a situation when this is bad is if, they're able to play a Lantern Fox for 3 mana and you're forced to answer it with the Egg-Morph and then attack, and you aren't able to develop your own threats, because even though you've answered the Lantern Fox with just a card, you've traded so much in terms of time that they are able to develop more, and you're constantly snowballing in the wrong direction. And I think this is actually demonstrated pretty well in a game I played with the Drawhorn deck, where I had to make the choice of developing my board or Egg-Morphing, and that's one of the limitations of a card like Egg-Morph that costs more mana for an answer, because even though it answers anything in a very efficient way in terms of cards, it requires most of your turn and it's a huge tempo loss, which is how cards are balanced. So those are the types of hard answers. Now, in terms of soft removal, we have something like Demonic Lure. Something else would be Repulsor Beast, sometimes Hearth Sister, Juxtaposition. These are mostly movement cards. You can have something like, I think, Sand Trap, which will prevent movement, and you can play around the card. You could have something even like a Glacial Barrier, blocking a minion off from the rest of the fight and stunning it if it attacks, could be a form of soft removal. So Demonic Lure is great against things like Amara Healer that, come down, don't get any value immediately, and if you can answer a 6 mana for 2 mana, and then win in the intervening turns, you've basically traded 6 mana for 2 mana, even though you've lost a card. Because if you can make that card not matter, if the game ends before that card comes back into play, it effectively doesn't exist at all. So these are the type of answers we have. And, they're good in different situations, and they're good in different game plans. We wouldn't really play, Egg Morph in a very aggressive deck because we don't have time to spend 4 mana Egg Morphing things. Our time is used to develop threats. We don't play Demonic Lure in, well, actually it does see play in some control decks, but it's weaker against some aggressive decks because sending a card back doesn't eliminate the threat, and if we're trying to wear them, out attrition a deck, then we can't be trading one of our cards for 0 of their cards. So that's and if we don't have the ability to end the game quickly, then eventually that card will come back into play. So these are kind of the times when they're strong and weak. And the thing about answers is that they have situations when they are weak. So that's what makes it so important to find the right balance and play them in the right situations. And then the last thing, access sort of to evaluate our cards is how does it fit in our deck? And does it advance our game plan? Does it make other cards better? And how does it affect our matchups? And these are some of the harder questions to answer, and this is really when you get into the actual deck building side of the game and why it's so difficult. Because you can't just throw together a group of cards with a high raw power level and have the best decks. You can have a good deck by doing that, but if your deck doesn't have cohesive game plans, if it doesn't have synergy, and it doesn't understand its matchups, then you're going to be at a disadvantage. So, something like Spelljammer draws cards. It's a very powerful card, almost in a vacuum. It just provides a very strong ability. You're going to draw the card first, and if they need to answer it, you'll have the ability to get up on cards because they'll have to, answer it with one card, and you'll have already drawn a card. So Spelljammer is a very good card. However, if your plan is to out-attrition your opponent, then the prospect of giving them cards, if they're in an aggro deck, then putting a body down that isn't going to be able to eliminate many of their threats and also doesn't prevent them from attacking you because it doesn't have provoke, doesn't advance your game plan of out-attritioning your opponent. So there are situations where Spelljammer is not a good card because it doesn't fit with our game plan, even though its power level is very high. So then we have something like Four Winds Magi. And Four Winds Magi is a card that has a deck building cost because you need to play some amount of spells for it to be most effective. But when you talk about cards that have deck building costs, the flip side of that is that it makes your other cards better. Four Winds Magi makes every spell card in your deck have the potential to deal 1 damage to the enemy general and restore 1 health to your general. So each spell you think of putting in your deck after Four Winds Magi gets a boost from that. And if you have a deck with a bunch of spells, then putting the Four Winds Magi makes them all more effective. And so that's why Songhai is able to play so many, lower end or lower impact spells that are cheap, because they have cards like Blood Rain Mask and Four Winds Magi that allow them to get an extra impact out of each of these spells. So that's another consideration. And then we have Blistering Scorn. And Blistering Scorn is a card that can be a good overall card, but it's most useful in specific matchups. So, for instance, I was playing the Unseven Sarge deck the other day, and I felt like Blistering Scorn had pretty negative synergy with a lot of cards in my deck, because I was playing a lot of artifacts, and it, when you play it, it takes a durability off those artifacts, and losing, a durability is a pretty big cost. But I found that when I took them out, I had very little ability to deal with cards like Heartseeker or with walls that were coming out of the Vanna generals. So in my matchups, even though it didn't help in most average Kate's games, it was very effective in my problem matchups. So even though I felt like it had some anti-synergy, I felt that it was necessary to keep it in order to provide my matchups that needed help with that extra boost, even though it didn't help in the average case game that was against game decks that I didn't need help with. But since those were games that I felt like I was winning anyways, I didn't necessarily need the the extra cards in those matchups to be more effective. If you can win a game even with the card not performing at its best, but then have the added benefit of it performing very, very well in matchups where other cards aren't performing effectively, that's a card that works well in your deck because of matchups, even if it doesn't fit the rest of our criteria. So that was today's video. I think I definitely stumbled in a lot of places, and I think I definitely rambled in a lot of places. But I think I talked about some decent concepts, and I'd really like to hear some feedback on what people would like me to talk about more, and what I did a good job of, and what areas that I didn't do a very good job of. So thanks for watching. I know this got pretty long, but I do appreciate it. Have a good day.